right, I'd like to introduce Bruce Albright. He is an administrator up in the Buffalo Red Watershed District, and he earned an award as the most distinguished administrator this past year. He's been an exemplary in all kinds of constructive pilot projects and work. So, introduce yourself a little bit.
Yes, as Jill said, my name is Bruce Albright, and I come from the Red River Valley. I'm associated with Buffalo Red River Watershed District. Moorhead, Minnesota is in our watershed, so, and I guess what I find interesting is how this all ties together here this morning from what we heard Daryl talk about, and of course Al with the One Watershed, One Plan and Minnesota Drainage Law. I hopefully will be able to give you some examples as to how we put this into effect with the local landowners. One of the things, of course, that we've already talked about this morning is the funding needed to make this happen. Minnesota now is in the 5th year of the Lessard Outdoor Heritage Council funding, I believe, the 3/8 of 1% sales tax. We have been successful in getting a number of grants to put conservation on the land. Of all of those projects listed there that we've received funding for, 2 of them are actual studies, the rest are land conservation practices. The 2 that are studies include the terrain analysis, and I'll get into that a little bit more when we get to it, and then the targeted drainage water management, which is working with all of the drain tile that is now going into the Red River Basin. We heard earlier this morning in southern Minnesota, in the last 5 years now, tile has come to the Red River Valley. The Buffalo Red River Watershed District, we cover 1,800 square miles in parts of Clay, Becker, Wilkin, and Otter Tail counties. Very diverse landscape. This is the city of Moorhead. This would go out east over to Detroit Lakes. So we have lakes and forests up in this area. This would go down south to the city of Breckenridge, Minnesota. What we've done is broken this big 1,800 square miles down into, I think, 9 different planning regions because of the diversity that we're dealing with throughout the watershed. For example, the Western Planning Unit, this is the Red River of the North, that's our boundary with North Dakota. This Western Planning Unit is like 95% agriculture. In here you do see, they're somewhat tough to see, but we have close to 80 legal drainage systems, what Al talked about this morning. The Watershed District is the drainage authority that is defined in Minnesota drainage law, and those systems total some 470 miles in length. Watershed law, of course, is different. That's Chapter 103D. Al talked about drainage law being Chapter 103E. So we've got all these drainage systems to manage. What I would say about this is all of those ditches, I've been with the district for 35 years, and we've built 3 new systems, and one of those was to deal with an erosion problem. So the other 75 were put in the 1890s to about the 1920 timeframe. So that drainage was all put on the landscape some 100 years ago. Most of these drainage systems that you see in the western part of the district, this would be what we call the Beech Ridge area. This is what used to be Lake Agassiz. So in this flat ground in the western part of the district, drainage is needed for agricultural production. Some of the systems up in this area were actually put in to drain lake basins. This, Al went into a whole lot more detail, but these are some of the tools that the Watershed District would use. The one-rod buffer strip requirement on new ditches, or if you redetermine benefits. The statute that allows the incremental installation of buffer strips inside inlet controls. Al talked about the consideration of multi-purpose water management. And last but not least, of course, the impoundment and diversion and rerouting of drainage systems, drainage system waters. And we have used that in a couple of places to develop, restore Beeson Lake, which happened to be on County Ditch 15, and we've also done some dams on a Becker County Ditch 5 system. This was one of the earlier grants that I showed you. This is the retrofitting, as it's called, of Clay County Ditches 9, 32, and 33. The work was actually done in 2013-14. We installed 179 side inlet controls and over 40 acres of buffer strips on these 3 legal drainage systems. Clay County Ditch 33, 32, and Clay County Ditch 9. What's important to note here is this location. A, they all drain directly into the Red River of the North. B, about 3 miles downstream is the city of Moorhead, where they take their raw water intake for their drinking water supply is that Red River of the North. So these are just upstream. Projected reductions because of the project, reduce sediment loading by about 3,000 tons per year, reduce phosphorus loading by almost 4,000 pounds per year. Some before and after shots. These ditches, when they put an open side inlet into the ditch, this gets into somewhat geomorphology, but what happens, here's the county ditch, there's the field ditch going out away from the ditch, and this field ditch is going to want to cut and get to the elevation of the county ditch. Another example of that, after the project was completed, we come in and put the side inlet in. We raise this berm up so that the ditch can help contain the flows. Typically, the culvert is equipped with a flap gate so that when the water in the ditch gets at a level that's higher than what's out in the field, it prevents the water from backing out into the farmer's field. And then, of course, the one-rod grass buffer strip, which we post, and drainage law has provisions to maintain. And we do get some that, of course, it's always the hired man that farms them up, but we do get some where we have to go back in and enforce putting the buffer strip back on. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification Program just because you've got the afternoon part of your agenda dedicated to that topic. I will note some highlights. One of those being that Buffalo Red was one of 4 pilot areas in the state of Minnesota. This started back in, I believe, the spring of 2013. When we got a notice from the Department of Ag that anyone interested, you've got about 3 weeks to get your application in, and the board at Buffalo Red, which is 7 managers from the various 4 counties who are appointed by their county commissioners, said we would like to be involved with the water quality certification program. Our pilot is about 214 square miles in Wilkin and Otter Tail counties. Whisky Creek, which is one of the main outlets for that particular watershed, is impaired for turbidity, dissolved oxygen, fecal coliform, and aquatic macroinvertebrates. What I will point out here is, of course, is the uniqueness of this watershed. Right about here again is the Beach Ridge. This is the low, flatter ground down here, what used to be Lake Agassiz. This is the higher glacial moraine area. And in the Beech Ridge area, you probably pick up 400 to 500 feet of elevation in 2 to 3 miles as you come off the old shores of the lake bed. Obviously, a lot of people involved in being a pilot. This has been a lot of work. It's a very labor-intensive program. It's the local soil and water conservation districts that are the promoters of the program, West Otter Tail and Wilkin. I think one of the keys I want to point out here, and they'll probably get that this afternoon, and it's already been mentioned this morning, is that local contact. Wanted people familiar to producers to market the program. One of the 4 pilots decided, for whatever reason, to go out and outside and hire a person, and they're behind the other 3. When we did it locally, there's that trust factor that was spoke about earlier this morning, because you're asking a lot of questions of these people. You know, when do you apply your fertilizer, at what rates, how do you use pesticides, do you have drain tile, are you doing irrigation? And that trust was a big key in my mind to making this all work. Just a structure of how we set it up. Of course, it starts with the Department of Agriculture down to the watershed. We have local steering and advisory committees, and then at the field level, it's the 2 counties. Just a listing of our advisory committee. What's important to note here, of course, is landowner, 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 landowner. We quickly identified what were the incentives that were going to work for Whisky Creek. You know, the different things work throughout various parts of the state. In this particular watershed, it's the side inlet sediment controls. I had an earlier example of that. Water and sediment control basins, especially in the areas that have more topography relief. Obviously, buffer strips, cover crops, the various state and federal programs out there, WRP, CRP, RIM, CREP. We did get funding assistance from both the NRCS and Bowser to help implement this program. EQIP is NRCS, and we do state cost share up to 75% to install those practices. Probably won't deal a whole lot with this. We'll talk a little bit. We can go in specifically for each pilot and set up a scoring system. So ours is not the same as the Whitewaters or Sauk River, for example. We could deal with the issues that were pertinent to Whisky Creek. And there is your first certified producer in the state of Minnesota. Jerry Nordick and his son Jared, and Jared is here with us today, so if you'd just hold your hand up. First certified producers in the state of Minnesota. Mr. Biampa here is the district manager for the Wilkin Soil and Water Conservation District. He phoned me up, I think it was probably last April, and said, we have a producer that's ready to be certified. And the first thing that came to my mind when he told me who it was we didn't have to use the carrot, load them up with, here's all kinds of dollars, please do this. Nor did we have to use the stick going, you're violating this rule, you're breaking this rule. They were doing it because it made sense for their operation. And I just won't ever forget that, because that was the first thoughts that came to my mind. Another certified producer in the Whisky Creek area, Mr. Rick Drevelo, and of course the thing to note there is he is a livestock producer, so it can work for livestock as well. There's a lot of tools in the watershed's toolbox. This has been the biggest thing to happen to the Red River Basin in my 35 years of being there, and it was an initiative that was started actually by a group called the International Water Institute, After, you've probably all seen some of the historic flooding we had, most notably 1997, 2009. An international group called the IJC said you need to get better data to work with. Prior to that, we were using the U.S. Geological Survey maps, contours at 5-foot intervals. In the Flat Red River Basin, I've got 5 feet of fall in 3 miles. So we, Mr. Chuck Fritz with the IWI spearheaded this effort, and we now have LiDAR data for the entire Red River Basin in the United States of America. And this stuff is plus or minus 2 to 3 inch accuracy. What you can do with that data, to me, is almost mind-boggling, but they come up with what's called a stream power index, and they condition that LiDAR data. What the LiDAR data does not know is how the water gets through a road, for example. So somebody has to go in and condition that model and says, I know the water is getting from one side of the road to the next. Then they can come in and look at where this water is flowing, and they can start to identify where you have potential for soil erosion. So a yellow stream or a green stream would probably mean not a whole lot of concern. When you get down to orange or red triangles, you go, I think I've got a problem. We did go out and field verify some of this. That location is that location, and the same here. So it's almost spot on. One of the grants that we got that I showed you earlier was to do this for the entire Buffalo Red River Watershed District. So when you have limited resources and dollars, this information is shared with all of our partners, primarily the Soil and Water Conservation District people. But when they sit down with a landowner and go, I've got X amount of funding, let's fix the worst first, this kind of a tool allows that to happen. One of the other grants, of course, that we had got, again, kind of giving you examples of putting this to the landscape from a watershed perspective. This was a Wolverton Creek project we had. This was work on the lower end. Again, geomorphology going on here. We had degrading channels, water trying to cut down to the depth of the creek. We went in and installed inlets and then seeded that area. Again, degrading channel on Wolverton Creek through the use of a series of rock drop structures and buffer strips. We went in and restored that and stopped that erosion. From a watershed perspective, we like to look at comprehensive or integrated projects, kind of the big overall look. I said earlier that we cover 1,800 square miles. We kind of have to take bites of the apple. This is a small drainage area. It's about 10 square miles, but it is that small bite of that 1,800 square mile apple. We do a lot of work in the basin under the guidance of what's called a mediation agreement. What that says is landowners come in, talk to the watershed, say, I've got a problem. We then sit down with what we call a project team that includes Soil and Water, MPCA, DNR, Fish and Wildlife, Army Corps of Engineers, and together we work out a solution. So it isn't the watershed coming up with the solution and then going to the agencies and say, will you permit this or will you allow this to happen? They are a part of the solution process. This project had multiple components on it. And what this started as is, we have 2 tributaries out here. This is County Ditch 34, which is a straightened reach of Whisky Creek. Here's the city of These people in here were experiencing flooding and crop loss, and this started out as, let's just add 2 laterals to County Ditch 34 using Minnesota drainage law. It went to the mediation project team, and we came up with the multifaceted project that included retirement of some land, marginal land at this location and this location. Each of these tracts are about 400 acres of Wetlands Reserve Program lands with NRCS. We installed an impoundment. This channel was dug using a conventional design, 6-foot bottom, 3-to-1 side slopes. This was our first experience with a 2-stage channel. Al might have even suggested that to us back 10 years ago. Of course, when we were installing that 2-stage channel, the contractor, the landowners just shook their head and said, "What are you doing?" We said, well, we're going to learn about this together. There is that 2-stage channel. This was what it looked like before construction. This is during construction. So you're telling the contractor to put these meanders in there. A 2-stage channel has a deeper meandered channel in the bottom and a wider floodplain channel, usually 2 feet, 2 to 3 to 4 feet, depending on the geometry of the stream you're working on, above it to carry the high water flows. Last year in 2014, we came in by landowners asked us to clean the conventional channel. We removed anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 foot of sediment that had built up in this channel. The 2-stage channel has not had to been touched. Kind of the proof is in the pudding. This is how we can sell this type of thing to landowners, because what they tell us is they need to see these practices on the ground. The Watershed's toolbox, of course, is quite large, again, with Minnesota Watershed Law, the Chapter 103D. One of the things to note there is that all of our efforts have to be a part of this revised watershed management plan. In that plan, we identify existing and emerging issues. We have district programs. We do have rules. We do data collection and management. A new concept added in 2010 are these regional assessment locators, where we actually have set up points throughout the district where we go back and continue to monitor both water quantity and quality. Talked about earlier how we had to break that down into planning regions. Each of those regions have targeted goals for both water quality, flood damage reduction, and natural resource enhancement. We do have the TMDL studies that are ongoing. Buffalo River was one of 3 pilots in the state of Minnesota when MPCA adopted the watershed concept. And it was our board, or my board, that said they were going to come in and spend $350,000 on a segment of stream in the middle of the watershed, about a 6-mile segment. And we said, you got to look at the entire watershed. And of course, the 1W1P, we've talked about that a little bit already this morning. In some cases, you have a county water plan, you have a county comprehensive local water plan, you have a soil and water conservation district plan, you have a watershed district plan. The hopes would be that we can tie all of those together and work together with one common set of goals. We've seen some of this already this morning, of course. You've got to be able to sell this to landowners. In 2010, we actually did a social indicators survey of some 1,300 landowners in Buffalo Red River Watershed District. Last year, we did a knowledge, attitude, and practices survey. That was applicable to the Whisky Creek water quality certainty area. And some things that were identified there, was a general lack of knowledge about the consequences of water pollution. This was interesting that local landowners put their trust, and we've already heard this morning, into local agencies, watershed districts, soil and water conservation districts, for water quality information. They said that the watershed is in an advantageous position to conduct effective community outreach, education, information. We'll see how we do in that regard, because the CAP study was ran last year, and it'll be ran again when we finish up the certification program, I believe, in 2016. And we already heard we get different survey results when we're talking to landowners or renters. I did not put our website on here. It's just any search engine will find BRRWD.org, and we post all of our minutes and projects on there. So, any questions?
Would you say something about the advantages of having a watershed district and a SWCD working together in a watershed like that?
Well, I think the main advantage is clearly you can see, and we have excellent working relationships with our 4 soil and water conservation districts, but given this huge challenge of all this work we've got to do, no one agency is going to do it by itself. I think the one watershed, one plan in our particular watershed is not going to be a hard sell. A couple of the counties have already said they want to do that, make it happen. Other areas of the state, that's going to be more difficult. But I just look at it from the volume of work that needs to be done. We need to all work together, and we're still not going to accomplish our goal. Yes, sir.
How is the 50-foot buffer going to go over with farmers?
The question was, how is the 50-foot buffer going to go over? Mr. Jaski will probably give us more information here shortly, but what we are doing is taking that one step further now, and we're actually doing the hydrologic modeling of these streams and waterways. You know, 50 foot is a number, and what we're working with landowners on is, if you've got a 10-foot high bank next to the stream and the water runs in the other direction, why have a 50-foot buffer there? But if you go a quarter mile downstream and there's a low floodplain area, that buffer might need to be 175 feet. So we're taking the science and saying, working with landowners, they know where those areas are. We've had, you know, we've been in a wet hydrologic cycle. I said I could put a technician out in the field in June because they've lost their second crop of soybeans in those areas because of heavy rains. So we're using science to improve on that. It's going to take some work, but I think we can get it done. But 50 foot to us it's a number. We're looking at using science to modify that.
I have a question. That controversial bypass of Fargo, the $2 billion diversion plan, do you see any hope that you have sufficient data and landowner buy-in that if those kind of resources were invested in the types of mitigation that you're talking about, that we could avoid implementing those sorts of controversial and costly plans because we're managing the water upstream rather than just putting dikes and bypasses around cities?
Oh boy, the watershed in the last month or two here has been right in the crosshairs of the whole diversion discussion because we've been asked to approve their fiscal year 15 budget of $210 million, and that's another story I'd be happy to talk to you about over the noon hour. Various studies that have been done show that, well, we've all in the region identified that cities like Fargo, Moorhead, Winnipeg, Grand Forks, East Grand Forks should have 500-year protection. And in order to get 500-year protection, we're talking the diversion. You cannot get there with diking. Moorhead has spent close to $100 million now, and they're protected to the 100-year event. Fargo is working on that. All of the things we can do that I've showed you up here, wetland restorations, floodwater retention, are all steps in the right direction. But for that particular project, it does not replace the proposed staging area that they're going to have south of Fargo Moorhead. The big question, I don't know if we got any DNR people here today, but the big question is they're doing the Minnesota Environmental Impact Statement right now for that project. And is DNR going to grant them a permit to stack, I think it's 400,000 acre feet of water upstream of a metropolitan area with probably combined population of 200,000 people? It's the old coin has two sides. It's the Watershed District's hopes. We represent 38,000 people in the city of Moorhead. We represent the landowners in the staging area. This is a regional flood control project that's going to take time, and the Watershed can be the go-between to hopefully get the best project possible. The numbers show that if a flood like went through Grand Forks, East Grand Forks happened in Fargo Moorhead, it doesn't recoup in our lifetime. They're huge. I don't know if that's, yeah, everything we do helps, but that is a project that kind of stands on its own alone because of the reasons I mentioned.
Bruce, is the money or the projects for it was in the Farm Bill, the regional critical conservation areas, is that going to provide any funding or help to some of that?
Our hopes, as well as Congressman Peterson, who was one of the primary pushers to get that money brought to the Red River Valley, would be that we could do these multi-purpose projects to make small steps towards, meeting those goals. What I'm seeing now is when you take a program that starts out in Washington, D.C., and by the time it gets down to the local delivery people, this last 2 or 3 weeks, there's been a whole lot more no's than let's work together. Can't do that, can't do this.
So we need to speak up.
Yeah, it's $50 million plus another 12 through the RCPP, so we're talking about $62 million over the next 4 years, and how can we meaningfully use that funds?
All right, we need to get John Jaski on, so hopefully you guys can have more discussion over lunch. We will have a mic in the garden room.